DCA, Diversity, Community, and Achievement. We're talking about families. So again, you're not going to need your computer to the end. We're going to talk about a lot of our views, biases, archetypes around families today, about how we're going to interact with families and delve into that. Also talk about skills in terms of building relationships with families. And then at the end of the session today, you're going to have some time to think about how you're going to engage families this summer and engage families in the fall, and you'll be able to interact with a resource toolkit that we've got. All right, so let's get started. I want to remind you of the norms that we've had in these sessions so far. So stay engaged. I'm glad to see everybody's got energy this morning, but make sure you're engaged with what we're talking about and not something else. Speak your truth. Remember to use I statements. Okay, we want to talk about I feel or I have seen or my experience, and not make broad, sweeping generalizations about other people or other things. Experience discomfort. That's a really important one. If you're engaging with this material really fully, you should experience some discomfort. That's a good thing in these sessions. We want to make sure that we are fully engaging, and if you don't feel discomfort, try to engage more. Okay, try to really dig deep and fully, consider the questions and fully consider your own views on them. Expect and accept non-closure. This is a long process. It's not going to get done in this meeting or even in the other 4 meetings we're going to have this summer or in your placement in the fall. It's a conversation that we should be having for the rest of our lives. It's a skill set that's going to help us out in everything that we intend to do in our professional career. And then last, remember to listen. Listen and try to understand what other people are saying. Don't try to leap to a conclusion about what they have to say, but try to understand where they're coming from. All right. Let's recap DCA 1 really quickly. One of the concepts that's going to be pretty key for the remainder of our time together is this idea of having archetypes and biases, meaning that the experiences that we've gone through, the things that we have seen, cause us to have conceptions of the right and wrong ways to do things, or what a good student looks like versus a bad student. Also, that leads us to do things like have stereotypes and microaggressions. That word microaggressions is one that I really want to focus on today. An example of a microaggression might be if a woman was walking down the street and saw like a young black man walking towards her on the sidewalk, she would clutch her purse closer to herself, right? Communicating this either subconscious message or like not explicit, but certainly a message gets conveyed about her biases and archetypes around how she feels about that young black man walking towards her. Anybody else think of an example of a microaggression? Go ahead.
I know for a lot of mixed race people, the question, what are you considered a microaggression?
Yeah, good. Or maybe the question like, where are you from? Okay.
For me, this is a microaggression. It could be thought of as a different. But I feel like talking to people in Spanish first who look a certain way before you communicate in English.
Yep.
It's one that has happened to me and I've seen.
That's a good example. Maybe an example in the classroom, thinking about if you got something heavy to move and you say, oh, can I get some of these young, strong boys to come help you move this? And the message that conveys about young girls, right, or young women. I want to have us all think more specifically about special education microaggressions, because having me think about microaggressions, like preparing for these DCA sessions and thinking about it through a SPED lens, like I realize that they are all over the place. Like they are pervasive in the kind of education world that we deal with. So I saw some raised hands and some people had an example. Yep. So an example of a microaggression might be like the distinction between like our kids and your kids. Like if you were engaging with a general education teacher and they were describing the resource students in their class as your kids and not our kids, I would definitely consider that a microaggression. Another one would be people first language. Like if I say an autistic student, I don't want to say that. I want to say a student with autism, right? And think about the distinction between colored people and people of color, right? It's a big distinction, and it's the same way in special education. We don't want to put the disability first that defines a person. It's a person with a disability. I can think of maybe a few more in special education. Like they are pretty pervasive. So I think about like us when we say FitFo. Okay? Think about like saying freak the fuck out, right? And if what we really mean by that is don't have an inappropriate anxiety reaction, like what is that really conveying about that? Anybody else got an example, please?
The same topic of education is something I notice a lot, and it's like microaggressions with, about like what a family should look like. I think that's really pervasive in your classroom.
Yep, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So, especially in terms of dealing with parents, right, and us making assumptions about them based on the way they look, the way they talk, the way that we think that they should be behaving, or indeed like making assumptions about them subconsciously based on the behavior that we see from their students, or the kinds of words that we hear their children speak, and that's something that we should caution ourselves from doing.
I just have a question for you. Like, I think a lot of us are SPED, and I'm wondering about calling students disabled. Is that okay? Because I know it's like differently abled or.
What would you say?
I never use disabled in a set. I might say with a specific learning disability, but it would be with blank, not like you are unable, disabled.
I would say students with additional needs.
Okay.
Another way to
Or special.
Special need or additional needs, or unique needs.
Yeah, and I just would use whatever that unique need is in their IEP.
Right.
Yeah, even the acronym like SPED, right? Like depending on context, can sound a lot like a slur, and so being really careful about how that's employed,
Or
I think is
like
really important. Go ahead.
the emotional disturbance. If you just talk about kids like these emotionally disturbed kids, that has such a connotation versus
Yep.
something that's
Absolutely.
classification and
I agree. And those words that we use like influence the perceptions that everyone has about students in special ed, right? Like people aren't going to have as much deep knowledge about these issues unless you share them with people, and part of that is teaching other people how to use appropriate terminology, right? And speak respectfully about students in special education. Let's keep going because we got a lot to talk about today, and we're going to get back to that later in the session. And then last, remember that we've got diversity competencies that are going to help us to be able to do these things appropriately. Okay? And the diversity competencies are right here. So the four of them are suspending judgment, meaning not leaping to conclusions, especially if someone does or says something that breaks one of our archetypes or we think is wrong, to wait a second before we jump and say that, like, oh, wait, don't say that. I think about that as like a guy taking a little second to pause, right, before he responds. Oh, by the way, like that's a good skill to teach special education students too, to pause before responding, especially if the student like tends to escalate. Still teaching him to pause and wait for a moment before responding is a big deal. Asset-based thinking, this is super important, especially for special education teachers. Thinking that people are not defined by whatever deficit they might have, and in fact that just because a student struggles in one area does not mean that they don't have other strengths, and especially focusing on those strengths. Locus of mind, locus of control, and a growth mindset, meaning we can't control everything, right? We can't control everything that happens in the classroom, particularly like we can't control what students that we get during the day. We can't control which students are on our caseload. We can't control the issues that they face, like in terms of disability, but looking at the things that we can change, looking at the things that we do have control over and choosing to focus on those as opposed to like seeing that, oh, there's so many things I can't control and just backing away and using that as an excuse to stop trying. And then last, interpersonal awareness. Being really cognizant of the relationships that we have, being really cognizant of other people's feelings and perceptions, and using those skills specifically in order to build relationships with other people.
And just real quick, I just want to make sure that I heard you when you were talking at the beginning of this page off. Can you pause? Can you just...
Oh, okay. So, yeah, like teaching students to recognize a situation when they might be like getting either stressed out or like starting to get angry. To like recognize those physical symptoms, you know what I mean? It's like when you're starting to feel warm, all right, then teaching them purposely to take a second to pause, to be mindful about what's going on and to like really think through their next action is a way to like help them to stop escalating in a classroom or out of a yard or in a lot of contexts.
Can I put you on the spot? Can you just model that real quick? Like if somebody's like getting angry, I mean, we walk up. I mean, we just, in our classroom, we have a kid.
It's something that you can't do it in the moment, you know what I mean? It's something that you need to teach purposefully beforehand to talk with them about, and then so in the moment they might be able to use that skill, and then rewarding them for using And yeah, we'll get into more of that, but not just right this second. I had some more graphics for these, but that's okay. All right, this is what we're going to do today. Our objectives is to be able to filter negative media messages about minority and low-income families. We're going to do a role play about repairing relationships that might have fallen apart, and then we're going to have some work time to work on effectively communicating with families over the summer and to start building those structures for the fall as well. All right. Let me ask you all to consider this for a minute. How might your personal experiences and your personal understanding of family influence your interactions and your expectations of student families that you're going to have this year? How do you consider a family? What does a good family or a good parent look like to you? How would you define that? I just want you to consider that for a moment. I'd like you to pick a person at your table. I want you to pair with them. And for the next 4 minutes or so, I want you to talk about a few of these questions. You don't need to hit all of them, but have these questions to guide your conversation. How do you define a family? How did your family play a role in your academic trajectory? All of us are college graduates here. What role did your family have in getting you there? And how does that influence your perception of what a good family should look like? Who were your influences when you were growing up? Who made you the person that you are? What is your vision for your students' families' involvement in their academic trajectory? What role do you think that parents should have in their students' lives to help them be on the right academic path? And then last, is there anything in the community experience that we had last week that influenced the way that you understand families, or especially families in this community? So again, you don't need to hit all of these points, but I'd like you to turn to somebody at your table and discuss around these issues. Go ahead.